Welcome, everybody, to part two of our 19th century colonialism as we look at Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and Europeans and how they interact. This week, or rather this lecture, we're going to look at the Ottoman Empire. First off, terms, fewer than with Africa, but they still also apply back and forth to one degree or another. There is less direct colonization of the Ottoman Empire than there is of Africa, but a lot of the policies that you can see at play in Africa do come to play in the Middle East. So that's why we only have one page of terms. The first one is a Ottoman word, well, a Turkish word, Tanzimat. Tanzimat is an effort to reform the Ottoman society through changes in education, the military, and economic practices. It's kind of hit and miss, and we'll see how it plays out in the 19th century. Next up is the Young Ottomans, which then later become the Young Turks. Both are youth movements within the Ottoman Empire that sought to radically change the empire from basically religiously themed monarchies that are aimed at recapturing the glory of the past into a more forward-looking secular society, preferably with some kind of representative government. Next is the Suez Canal. This is a project that was completed in 1869, an Egyptian-French joint project that saw the connection of the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea, which then cuts down on travel between Asia and Europe dramatically. And then finally, cash crop economy. This is an emphasis upon non-edible products, things like cotton or tobacco, that are valued for their resale abroad and tend to bring in high dollar. And this is usually at the expense of sustenance crops, things like cereals or vegetables, that sort of thing. A good example of this is growing cotton in Egypt, as we will see happens in the mid-19th century. Now, the Ottomans up until 1900, until 1800 rather, they are relatively equivalent to any given European power vis-a-vis the military, with economic influence, and in general standard of living. That all begins to fall by the wayside in the 1800s. The disparity becomes accelerated as more and more of Europe becomes mechanized. There's a resistance within the Ottoman Empire, particularly against mechanization, because it is seen as some kind of Christian innovation that is anathema to a good Muslim society. Now, is this true? Absolutely not. And it is an evidence of some of the deep problems that the Ottoman Empire has, which unfortunately we cannot really go into. On top of it, there are some issues within the Ottoman Empire as provinces begin to rebel and become difficult to control. Part of this is because of European meddling in those regions, particularly in Egypt, Arabia, Greece, the Balkans, and other regions, all in an effort to undercut not just the Ottomans, but also their European rivals. Now, there were some attempted reforms within the Ottoman Empire, particularly within the military. There was the attempt in 1807 by Selim III, a relatively strong-willed and very forward-looking sultan who attempted to change the way that the military structured itself along European lines, particularly along a kind of French model using modern drilling techniques and using modern equipment. This didn't end well for Selim III, who was eventually deposed by a rebellion by the Janissaries, and who eventually executed him. He accidentally died in custody. And if you can hear the air quotes under accidentally or around accidentally, you understand what I mean. One of his generals at the time, or at least somebody who was inspired by him, was an individual known as Mehmet Ali, an Albanian-born general who really saw the value in this kind of reform that he was attempting. Unfortunately, he also saw the consequences of trying to implement these reforms without laying the groundwork first. Another student of that failed attempt at reform is someone named Mahmud II, also a sultan. He, in 1826, remembers the lesson that Selim III unfortunately did not live through and is able to turn the tables on the Janissaries, essentially wiping out the Janissaries as a military force, quite literally. He knew they would rebel. He had a very well-trained uh, modernized artillery unit. And by artillery, we also mean cannons that were filled with grape shot, which are anti-personnel. And so when predictably the Janissaries rebelled and they rushed the palace, the artillery was waiting for them in place with cannons loaded and mowed them down, absolutely slaughtering the Janissaries. So we have this dysfunctional relationship between Europe and the Ottoman Empire. Europeans are constantly undermining the Ottoman Empire throughout the late 18th and into the early 19th century. A good example of this is when Napoleon invades Egypt in order to establish order on behalf of the Sultan. He does so in 1798. There's a rebellion in Egypt. The brash upstart revolutionary himself leads a good portion of the French army to invade Egypt, during which he hears news of there being an opportunity for a coup d'etat back in France, so he abandons his army to go make himself emperor of France, and the army is left to face a combined English Ottoman invasion force who pretty much slaughter the French to a man and eventually eject the French. Now, if you thought the Ottoman Empire was quite grateful to the English, of course they were. But Mehmet Ali remembered the lessons of the Ottoman Empire, and I think he was disillusioned with the Ottoman Empire, seeing the modern might of these European nations compared to the Ottoman, which had a lot of men, but not very much in the way of technology, or at least not as modern as technology as they could have had. And so he proclaimed himself Pasha, or governor of Egypt. And of course, the Ottoman Sultan was in really no position to depose him in 1801. Thus, we have this new modern state arising in Egypt at the head of a rather firm leader, we'll say. We'll call them an enlightened dictator. Now remember, Selim III has not yet been killed. So this rebellion is not quite in revenge for the death of Selim III, but it did inform what would later happen in Egypt. Mehmed Ali installs himself basically as a dictator, and he goes about reforming the military from the ground up. Luckily, there are no Janissaries that he has to deal with, and in fact, when he sees the death of Selim III, he probably breathed a sigh of relief. He also begins to reform the economy. He encourages tourism to come to Egypt, but he also engages in a cash crop economy for fast cash. Essentially, for thousands of years, the way agriculture worked in Egypt was the land was held by whoever was in charge, and the peasants worked the land for the benefit of the country, for the benefit of whoever was in charge. And so they were allowed to grow whatever they felt was necessary. A very kind of, if you think proto laissez-faire, there was no real directive. So most of them grew foodstuffs. Foodstuffs is not very valuable on the market. Comparatively, things like cotton, particularly in Egypt, to a lesser degree, tobacco, were very, very lucrative. And so when when Mehmet Ali took over, his cronies, his seconds in command, and his lieutenants, and all those began to divide up the land and create kind of a plantation system. And they used forced labor, what is known as corvée labor. Corvée is a nickname of a whip that was used to get the peasants to obey. So they basically deployed troops to force peasants to work on plantation uh, farms to produce cash crops. It turned out very good for the Egyptian economy overall because a lot of money began to flow in, which fed the reforms of the military, which fed the reforms of the schools and particularly learning. There were a lot more technical schools were opened, naval architecture schools, medical schools, that sort of thing. And so they had this moment of success for several decades. The Egyptian economy was actually growing, whereas the rest of the Middle Eastern economy, particularly the Persians in what is now modern day Iran, and the Ottomans were actually shrinking the economy. So there's this kind of success that's fed upon each other. And the Ottomans kind of rely upon that success because although he's installed himself as a dictator, although he's installed himself as a governor, he is nominally loyal to the Sultan of Egypt of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottomans, when they are experiencing rebellions, particularly in the Arabian Peninsula, they call upon the Egyptians to go and put that rebellion down. Well, that worked perhaps a little too well because when the Muhammad Ali and his sons are able to capture Mecca and Medina and capture the rebellious House of Saud. Yes, the very same Saud that is in charge of Saudi Arabia. Captures many of the leaders of the House of Saud and executes them. They then pivot and start to invade places like Palestine and Syria. And they're only turned back by a Anglo-Ottoman coalition, which essentially stops the invasion from Egypt into deeper into Ottoman territory. Now, there's an emulation and kind of an admiration, at least on the part of some of the reforming sultans. Now, Sultan Mahmud, who is actually in charge of the Ottoman Empire when they have to stop the um, Egyptian invasion of Ottoman territory, he takes a cue from Selim III and also from Mehmet Ali. I mentioned before how he lured the Janissaries into rebelling. He kind of provoked a fight that he knew he could choose the place that the fight would happen. He would choose the conditions under which it would happen and essentially slaughtered them, allowing him to basically build the military from the ground up. He also institutes what are policies that are very similar to the Egyptian policies that are referred to as Tanzimat. It's a very European model in which schools, particularly technical schools, become secularist rather than religious. This strikes a bad tone in the Ottoman Empire that has some very powerful imams who are upset at the loss of their prestige and their ability to control the education. They see it as a selling out of religious principles for this anti-God secularism. But he also does engage in some modernization and industrialization. The only problem is it's kind of hit and miss because while the Ottomans are still very much attempting to reform their economy, they're also being undercut by the Europeans that they're supposedly helping, that they're supposed to be getting help from uh, to modernize the economy. The problem with that is that a lot of the Europeans want something in exchange for this expertise that they're giving over, and sometimes that thing that the Ottomans give up is their autonomy, their ability to innovate and to industrialize along Turkish lines rather than along European lines, and for Turkish interests rather than European interests. Europeans are essentially playing games with the Ottomans. Um, in addition to undercutting the economic development of the Ottomans, because it's beneficial in the European mindset not to have a strong Ottoman Empire, it is beneficial not just for their own individual interests, but also for European interests, and also because honestly, quite a bit of racism and anti-Muslim sentiment. France encourages rebellions of Christians, for example, in Syria and Lebanon. And then when the Ottomans step in to put that rebellion down, the French step in and invade and protect these Syrian and Lebanese Christians from the Ottomans, often counting them as French citizens and making them immune to Ottoman laws. England encourages rebellion of the Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula, continues to do so even though a rebellion just got put down. And now you know why the House of Saud is still pretty powerful now. Austria-Hungary and Russia and others encouraged the Balkans to rebel. So you have Greece breaking away, Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, all of those begin to kind of rebel against Ottoman rule. And the Ottomans are forced to sign a treaty in the 1870s that gives up their acquisition of those territories. The Russians eat away at some of the territories on the other side of the Black Sea. They capture Crimea and other places as well. So essentially, although theoretically the Europeans are there to quote unquote help the Ottomans, their help is kind of a not a very good one. It's a kind of a frenemy situation. And so we have this clash of reforms. As I mentioned earlier, Mehmet Ali and his sons were relied upon by the Sultan, particularly in putting down a rebellion in Arabia. That goes very well, but it also demonstrates the power of those new reforms and also the robustness of the new Egyptian economy. This conquest of Palestine and Syria threatens the Ottoman Sultan, so the Ottoman Sultan has no choice but to call upon the English because his reforms are just in the fledgling stage, whereas the Egyptians have had a couple of decades to get things right. And so this battle at Konya in what is now modern day Syria drives the Egyptians back. And it establishes this this kind of bad blood between the Egyptians and the Ottomans. The Egyptian pashas begin to become more and more independent, ignoring the Ottoman Sultan. They encourage the use of Arabic rather than Turkish to differentiate between themselves and the Ottomans. And also, there's a little bit of a motivation um, to the attempt to conquer that territory, to attempt to conquer the Ottoman territory on the Egyptian point of view. To the Egyptians, the Ottomans are a little too cozy, a little too passive to the Europeans. And to the Europeans, the idea of a strong Middle Eastern state, whether centered in Istanbul or centered in Cairo or Alexandria, that's not going to fly. So a lot of the Europeans are eager to see the Egyptians brought down a peg. But the Egyptian economy is, as I mentioned before, relatively robust and remained so all the way through the 1860s. Ismail Pasha, who took power in 1863, relied upon particularly cotton during the American Civil War as a really bonanza of cash crops. It is more wealth coming into Egypt than ever had before. It seems to be going very well to the point where he engages a French architect named Ferdinand de Lesseps, pictured here in the nice blue suit and the wide-brimmed hat, to build a canal that connects the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. It is not only an example of the wealth that Ismail Pasha and the Egyptians have to execute a canal that had been planned since Roman times, but also a kind of investment. It was putting Egypt in an important position within the world economy. That if this were successful, if this canal is successful, they're going to charge people to go through it. And because Egypt becomes important to that interstate commerce, particularly between Asia and Europe, then they enjoy a preeminence, perhaps even more so than the Ottoman Empire. And so there was a Franco-Egyptian plan to connect those two bodies of water. Why is that important, you would want? Well, the canal begins to be dug at an unassuming port city called Suez. Suez was a relatively deep water port, and it also happened to be one of the railheads of a train um, transport system that led to the Red Sea, and eventually um, was replaced by that Suez Canal. Travel around Africa is roughly 12,000 miles, maybe a little bit more, about 12,300 miles to go from, say, London to Mumbai. You had to go around Africa. And of course, this is an approximation. This doesn't take into account having to stop for fuel, food, repairs, that sort of thing. British ports become incredibly important. So having a port in, say, Cape Town, South Africa becomes critical. What if you're a French ship? Well, then you're reliant upon British ports. If you're a German ship, you're reliant upon British ports. If you're an Italian or a Spanish or a Dutch ship, you are, for lack of a better term, reliant upon these ports that may be hostile to you at any given time, or they may charge you a lot more. British ports are important. The canal shortens the trip by about 5,000 miles, or about 40%, which is a pretty big chunk of reduction. So it cuts down on the cost of transporting goods from Europe to Asia and from Asia to Europe. Also, it brings in revenue because fees were charged according to the value of the cargo that went through the canal. Interestingly enough, most of the money does go to the French, but the Egyptians, who supplied the majority of the labor and a good portion of the funds, do get a chunk of that. So it's kind of an 70-30 split at this time. Interestingly enough, although the British were very keen to protest the building of this port, they saw it as a French power grab in what is traditionally an English sphere of influence. They poo-pooed it. They tried to torpedo the attempts to raise money by the French. Interestingly enough, the first ship through the canal was a English ship that snuck into first place and kind of wedged itself right there at the beginning in Port Said. I'm sorry, at Port Suez. So the English did recognize the importance of this canal. In fact, as it operated over the next several decades, it became critically important. One might say it was a strategic, valuable resource, uniquely suited for international trade. So, however, things aren't going too well after the 1860s for both the Egyptians and the Ottoman Empire. There's a rebellion that continues in the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans lose territory after territory. Tanzimat was imperfect. There was some cultural and religious resistance, as well as some undermining by the part of the Europeans, because they're still playing games. A good example of this would be attempts to reform the growing of tobacco and the manufacture of cigarettes within the Ottoman Empire. Well, unfortunately, in order to pay for some of the wars of rebellion against Syria, the Ottomans had taken out loans. Most of those loans were owned by French investors, who then, in order to pay off those loans, the Ottomans sold the rights to tobacco growing to French merchants. So the French government was encouraging rebellion in Syria. The Ottomans had to take out loans to put down these rebellions. Most of these loans were held by French banks, and in order to pay off those loans, they had to sell the monopoly right to grow tobacco to French merchants. And same is pretty much true for a lot of things. There is one thing that's slightly different, is that the Germans and Italians were actually pretty nice to the Ottomans, and to a lesser degree, as were the Americans. Egypt itself was a once rising power, but has since been diminished in the 1860s and 1870s, largely due to English interference. I mentioned sneaking the first ship through and getting into the canal first, being the first ship through the canal. The economy collapses as the cotton market collapses after the American Civil War, and cotton production resumes in the 1870s. There's also an economic recession in the late 1870s, early 1880s, as I mentioned in the Africa lecture, which then causes an even harder crash for the Egyptians. So there's too high of a debt to income ratio. England then invades Egypt in 1882 because Egypt has been defaulting on debts to England. England had been loaning the Egyptians money to help build the Suez Canal. I know, it sounds crazy, right? But here, the Egyptians needed money to help continue building the Suez Canal and to maintain it. So they had taken out loans as the collapse of the cotton industry continued. The banks kept changing the terms of rates for the Egyptians. Unlike the Ottomans, the Egyptians would not give over monopolies to English merchants. And so, unfortunately, the Egyptians defaulted on these loans rather than restructuring them as they would in any modern economy. The English invaded and basically took over Egypt, deposing the descendants of Mehmet Ali and putting in place a king, or what they referred to as a khedive, in Egypt, who was basically a puppet of the English government. The upshot is that because the Egyptians defaulted on the Suez Canal, the English now in 1882 assume a majority stake in the Suez Canal and reap the profits thereof. The French, to note, the French retain a small percentage of the stocks in the Suez Canal Company all the way into the 1950s. So as the big reformers, the big strongman reformers in both the Ottoman Empire and the Egyptian Pashanate kind of collapse, there are new reformers that begin to rise. There's these westernized youth who are very well educated, very articulate, and are eager to see a new society for a new century. They're typically liberal. They tend to be very liberalist insofar as wanting to modernize the economy, embracing laissez-faire capitalism, embracing industrialization, and embracing secularist society. First, we have the young Ottomans that arise in the 1880s and into the 1890s. Their foundation is the Ottoman identity. Unfortunately, because of all this Christian and Jewish and other ethnic rebellions throughout the Ottoman Empire, that doesn't really go anywhere. And so by the 1890s, the young Ottomans morph and become known as the Young Turks. So this Young Turk movement, this very brash, rebellious movement, embraces a very francophonic kind of point of view. Most of them haven't been trained in Paris, and so a lot of their writings are both in Turkish and French, because that would have been the language of education at the time. And in 1908, they get their chance. There is a crisis in the Ottoman Empire that leaves the Sultan relatively vulnerable. The economy's in shambles. There's a lot of rebellions. And so the Young Turks stage this kind of revolution in 1908. It's closer to a coup d'etat because a lot of these Young Turks were already appointed to an advisory kind of a parliamentary body. And so in many ways they set aside the old sultan, but there is also some street violence as well, as the sultan had attempted to crack down on the Young Turk movement in the streets by closing coffee shops and shuttering newspapers and that sort of thing. So it's kind of a mix between a revolution and a rebellion and a coup d'etat. So they depose the old sultan and they put a new puppet sultan in place who is in charge in name only, for no other reason than to appear to be a constitutional monarchy. They go about modernizing the military and the infrastructure, and this is where the Germans kind of come into play. In the early 20th century, the Germans offer to help develop the infrastructure, particularly the train system within Turkey, not in exchange for a monopoly, not in exchange for an exorbitant amount of funds, but actually they undercut the price offered by the French and the English at the same time. The U.S. plays a little bit of a role in this kind of altruistic reform movement, in that the United States establishes universities and schools, particularly the American University in Beirut and the American University in Aleppo. The American University uh, in Istanbul doesn't really take off quite as much. There are already several other competing universities that have much more cachet, particularly French and German-led universities. But the Germans and the Americans pretty much treat the Ottomans much, much better than the French or the English did. The Egyptians seem subservient to England, and so maybe the Ottomans are not really looking at the English as the allies that they could possibly be. It seems that every move made by the old European powers is calculated not just to benefit the nation of, say, France or England, but also calculated specifically to undercut the Ottomans and any kind of true reform, any kind of true modernization. So by the time we get to 1914, the Ottomans are a minor, if modernizing power compared to what they used to be. They could have been a much more powerful state had they not had the interference that they did. And so they're in this uneasy relationship with England and France, and maybe a little bit more friendly towards the Germans and to a lesser degree the Americans. Ottoman revamping the economy is rather hit and miss. That Tanzimat that I mentioned before kind of collapses. It doesn't really have the staying power, especially when you get some repressive sultans who are very conservative and closed-minded and religiously influenced. And also you have these foreign monopolies that are undercutting any attempt at entrepreneurship or in modernizing the economy. And of course, you still have these restless populations who are often falling into rebellion or at the very least some kind of resistance. And so maybe thanks Europe for the mess that you're making in our country. Increasingly, the Ottomans are dissatisfied with the way that their old relationships have been going, particularly with the English and the French, to a lesser degree the Russians, although the Russians are eating away at territory to their north. Russians are at least a little bit more upfront in their aggression. They typically tend to be very militaristic in their intervention, whereas the English and the French are usually conceal the dagger behind the back. All right, guys, that is it for this lecture. That'll cover the Middle East and Europeans in this particular chapter. You guys have a great weekend. I'll see you on Monday.